Hello, everyone, and welcome to the IGP's Soundbite for today. I'm delighted to welcome our speaker, Dr. Jonathan Ashong-Lamptey. Dr. Ashong-Lamptey is a globally recognized authority on diversity and inclusion in the workplace. He has a PhD from the London School of Economics. He's a fellow of the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales. And he's worked with the Cabinet Office and with organizations like Aviva Insurance, Sony Pictures, Condé Nast, and Foster and Partners. He's also the host of The Element of Inclusion, a weekly podcast that informs and educates using applied research and leadership. And I encourage you all to sign up and listen to him. He offers a particular combination of radical thinking and academic rigor. And what he's interested in is inclusive change. His interest also is in helping organizations to build business leaders and to build organizations where everyone belongs and everyone can contribute and everyone can perform to the best of their ability. And he's currently writing a book to support his mission to help 1 million people around the world to make the workplace inclusive. And he's going to talk to us this afternoon about how addressing racism in organizations leads to positive change for the way that they function. I asked him if he will be as provocative as he can, and he's promised that he will. And so, Jonathan, can I please welcome you to the IGP and ask you to take the floor?
Well, thank you so much, Professor Henrietta Moore. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm flattered to be here. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation. It's been a long time coming, and so I'm happy to share. I've got a couple of slides which I'm going to share to guide our conversation in the short time that we're together. If you bear with me while I did get that. Great. Can everybody see that? Excellent, excellent. So my intention here today is to give sound bites, right? So I want to leave you with a few thoughts, a couple of nudges really to provoke and inspire you in terms of all things diversity and inclusion, but also recognizing the context of race and racism. So I want to be really specific about that. There's so much that we can talk about. I understand that we're going to have an opportunity to speak later. There's a breakout room later. I will join you there as well if we don't get to discuss everything that we want to here and now. So I'm hoping you're going to look forward to this. I've been looking forward to this for a very long time. So really, what do we want to talk about? We talked about who I am very briefly. As I said, I'm Dr. Jonathan Ashong-Lamptey. Everyone calls me Dr. Jonathan. They find it easier to say. And I'm showing you this because this is the podcast. Every week we inform and educate using applied research and thought leadership. Please check it out wherever you listen to your podcasts. This is some of the organizations that we work with. So we work with organizations to make them inclusive. These are some of the people we've worked with over the past, I'd say 6 to 9 months. The one exception is the BBC. I haven't worked with them, but I did appear on BBC London News earlier this year talking about race and racism. And so some of what I said there is what I'm going to draw on with you today. So I've got a couple of things in mind that I want to discuss with you. So our agenda in the short time that we have, we're going to be talking about diversity and inclusion. We're going to be talking about race in that context. And so we're going to weave that together. Lots of conversation about race. What is racism? Black Lives Matter. We're going to address that. Also, I'm going to talk about I've got this unicorn here to talk about some myths and challenges that organizations are experiencing. And you'll notice I am focusing very much on a practitioner level. So it's not all about the theory and the research. I will draw on that, but it's about what organizations are thinking or doing or what they should be thinking or doing. And then I'm going to leave us with some tips about how to win through inclusion. And then we'll have a Q&A as well, where we can talk in a little bit more detail about the things that I've highlighted here. So I'm hoping that makes sense. And I hope that meets with your expectations. So with that in mind, my PhD. If you've ever met me, I never stop talking about my PhD. As I say, I introduced myself as Dr. Jonathan, and there's a particular reason for that we'll get into later. But my PhD was all around race and racism within the workplace. So everything that I talk about is based on the experience that I've had, the research that I've done. And what I found is when I came into the workplace to actually take all of this knowledge and put it into practice, I realized that there wasn't enough thinking. There wasn't enough clarity of thought. There was a lot of emotive conversations. So what we're going to be talking about here is going to recognize that, but put that in the perspective of an evidence-based approach supported by research, but not taking the research for granted. So a lot of the research that I'll be referencing, it won't just be studies of one or two groups in a particular area. And as many of you know, there's a lot of studies out there, particularly workplace studies, that take place and they focus on MBA students. This is not that. So just bear that in mind. Okay. So I want to give you a warning as well. So I know that we've got a lot of students here, but I do know that this is open to the public. Challenge is, some of the things we're going to be talking about here, we're going to be talking about race and racism. We may talk about it in a way that you're not used to, frankly, in a way that you may not even like. But I just want to manage your expectations here. A lot of the time you hear people talking about safe spaces. I want to make sure that everybody feels safe. Unfortunately, that is not my intention here. You may feel uncomfortable. You may feel discomfort about some of the things that we're saying. I just want to let you know, right? Just to manage your expectations. This is not what is intended to be a safe space. Maybe it normally is, but here it isn't. I really want to just provoke you and get you thinking in a way that may be uncomfortable. And some of the things I'm going to be saying are inconvenient. So just to manage your expectations. Okay, so let's talk about the new narrative. Why am I here? As I said, my PhD was around race, racism. I became very popular earlier this year, as you can imagine. So if we take a step back, the new narrative is talking about Black Lives Matter. Why is that? Actually, at the beginning of the year, in terms of the pandemic, diversity and inclusion, no one was really talking about it. Everyone had cut their budgets. People were desperate. It was embarrassing to see people who were diversity and inclusion experts. They're writing articles saying diversity and inclusion is still important. Please don't forget us. Everyone's cut their budgets. So people had forgotten about diversity and inclusion. Then all of a sudden, we had the murder, and I refer to it as a murder, of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, and the growth, and there was a growth and understanding, or was a desire to grow and understand a meaning around race and racism, right? Race, racism, and more importantly, anti-racism. But here's the question. How many people have actually investigated and thought, Black Lives Matter, what does it mean? What is it actually about? So if you look on their website, and I have, and so let's look at that, they're really, really clear. When they say Black Lives Matter, they're abundantly clear about what they mean and who they're speaking to. So some of what you see here, by the way, I've lifted from their website. Some of it's not available anymore. So the stuff you see on the right-hand side is, the stuff on the left-hand side isn't. I would recommend you check out the Black Lives Matter website, because the clarity of thought about what they're doing, what they're thinking, it sets a standard. Most organizations who talk about being diverse, being inclusive, they clearly haven't thought about it. The intellect it took to come up with what is presented here is immense. And so I want to draw your attention to it. So Black Lives Matter, if we look, and I want to focus here on the right, we are expansive. We are a collective of liberators. We believe in an inclusive and spacious movement. Inclusive and spacious. These may be words that you don't normally associate with Black Lives Matter. And they talk about intersectionality as well. And when I say that, it's not just about being Black as if it's a monolith. There are many aspects to that. We affirm the lives of Black, queer, and trans folks, disabled folks, and the list continues. So being Black is not just one thing, it's many things. But I want to draw your attention to the third paragraph. It says here, we are working for a world where Black lives are no longer systemically targeted for demise. That's an underlying principle of Black Lives Matter, that there is a systemic demise for Black people. But what does that mean? And so now we're starting to think, okay, race, racism, prejudice, all of these words are being thrown around, but you haven't really been told what they are. So I want to give you a little insight into the way that I think about this. And it's a practical way, because the terms race and racism are disputed. If I gave you a definition now, you're going to find problems with it. If you gave me a definition, I'm going to find problems with your definition. What I find it useful is when we're thinking about race and racism, is to think about it as a system. So we've talked about systemic, you hear this term systemic racism. What does it mean? So this is something that I shared on social media, on LinkedIn about 3 months ago. A lot of talk about it. It upset a lot of people. I'm going to walk through this with you to give you a useful way to think about race and racism, actually more about racism. So let's take a step back. Number one, Western society is racist. What does that mean? It's characterized by racism. So let's get an understanding of what we mean by racism. Racism is a system of advantage that provides benefits and privileges subject to your race. Okay, so it's a system of advantage. Some people get advantages, some people don't. So then the next thing as well, the system of racism promotes white supremacy. You've heard this phrase. No one really tells you what it means. Think of white supremacy as providing social, political, economic, but the point is benefits to people who are defined and perceived as being white. So it's not about your skin color. You have to be defined and perceived as being white. So it's useful to think of white, being white or whiteness as a quality. It's something that can be acquired by some, not everyone, but it's not necessarily about your skin color. To put that into context, think about Irish people. Over the past 150 years, there's an argument that Irish people became white in the past 100, 200 years. Prior to that, they were not considered to be white. They did not have whiteness. They were not benefiting in the same way as other people from this system of advantage. Think of Greek people in Australia. Are they white? Think of people who are Jewish. Are they white? So this concept of whiteness is useful to think of it as a quality, as opposed to having anything to do specifically with your skin color. And that's an important distinction, and you don't hear many people make it. And so number four, if you are defined and perceived to be white, whatever that means, you're at the top of a racial hierarchy. So we're saying that there is a hierarchy, and if you're at the top of that hierarchy, you get the benefits. If you're at the bottom, you either don't get the benefits, or as Black Lives Matter may argue, you are systemically demised. You're targeted for systemic demise. You're at the bottom. So for the most part, people will think and agree, if you're at the top of this hierarchy, if you're perceived to be white, you're at the top. But normally people will think that people who are Black are at the bottom. We can argue about who's in between, but there is a racial hierarchy. Now, as I've said here, you don't have to believe what I've just said. It's just useful. It's a useful way to think of race and racism, as opposed to being focused on prejudice specifically and discrimination. And we'll talk a little bit about those later on. So bearing that in mind, this may be something you want to come back to in terms of questions. But given that we're talking about race and racism, organizations started to realize that actually talking about race and racism is one thing, but it needs to be part of an ongoing conversation around diversity and inclusion. However, they weren't good at defining what diversity or inclusion is as well. And that becomes a problem. And so what you see is they made all these anti-racist statements. So they started making all these statements without being clear about what they meant. So here, and this is a great example, I just lifted these from a couple of papers. So brands follow anti-racist statements with donations. Entertainment companies are donating to anti-racist causes. So this is what happened. And I know you know because you saw it. So let's say June, July, organizations were falling over themselves to say, we're anti-racist. And they did three things. It was very predictable. One was to make an anti-racist statement. That was one thing. Two was to throw money at the problem. So they either made a donation to an organization, to a charity, but they outsourced the problem. They said, we're going to pay for this and we're going to make sure that, we are part of the solution, but they didn't do much work on what they were doing themselves. And then the third thing, which is once again very predictable, they pointed towards people within their organizations and said, we're going to outsource this problem. Therefore, we're going to call out racism as and when we see it, right? Racism is unacceptable. We want to be anti-racist. So we're going to call out racism as and when we see it. The problem with that is most racism in organizations is covert. It's not overt. It's very rare that people are pointing physically or calling people names, or actually overtly discriminating against people based on their race. For the most part, it's covert. It's things you can't see. It's microaggressions. And so we've got this distinction between prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice being prejudging, having preconceived ideas, and discrimination is what you see in practice, taking those preconceived ideas and denying people opportunities, treating them differently. And so really, organizations are focused on discrimination, but when you do that, it means you ignore this system that we've discussed here. And that's a massive challenge for organizations. And so they're making all of these statements, but they're not able to back it up. And the narrative about being anti-racist is crucial. They're making claims that they don't understand. What do I mean by that? In the book, How to Be Anti-Racist, which is a book that everyone's telling you that you should read in 2020, there's a really clear definition, which most of these organizations are completely unaware of. So this definition of racist, and by the way, I want you to look at how binary it is. It doesn't leave much room for, doesn't leave any wiggle room at all. So a racist, according to the book, is one who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inaction. Notice how I said inaction as well. So if you're a racist, if you're not doing things, you're not protecting or actually creating change. So an anti-racist is one who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing anti-racist ideas, right? So being anti-racist is a proactive term. So if you think of these organizations, they're just saying they're anti-racist. They're saying it's not good enough to be, say you're not racist, you need to be anti-racist, but being anti-racist comes with massive commitments that these organizations haven't really understood. And this is a challenge as part of our soundbites that I want to draw to your attention. And so there's a lot of language that organizations don't understand. And so they like to hide behind rhetoric. You may have seen, has anyone seen this? Diversity is a reality, inclusion is a choice. This may be something that you hear. It's great when at panel events, organizations, they say, oh, we're going to talk about diversity. Diversity is a reality, inclusion is a choice. Another thing you may have seen, diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. Now, once again, a lot of metaphors, great for winning hearts, but how does this help you next Tuesday, next Thursday, when as part of your job in your organization, in your institution, you actually need to understand what diversity is, what inclusion is, and how to actually act on these things in the context of racism and anti-racism that we've discussed. So what I want to do is offer you a definition based on the literature that I find really useful. So diversity, and by the way, notice that I'm thinking about this in an organizational context. I want to be really clear. So diversity is a management approach. It recognizes that as individuals, we all have differences and that there is value in those differences. So we're not all the same according to diversity. We are different. This is why me personally, I don't use words like equality much. You hear people talking about equity, and in fact, you hear people talking about belonging as well. There's a whole list of words that come up. And you may have heard the term Jedi. Has anybody heard the term Jedi before? Jedi. J-E-D-I. So that's justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. My point is, it's as if there's more and more words being thrown out there. I prefer to stick to these two. So diversity recognizes that we have differences. Inclusion, once again, look at the words I'm using, a systematic business strategy to ensure that everyone in an organization shares the same advantages and benefits. And this is why I say everyone can perform and everyone can belong. When I think of belonging, I think specifically around inclusion. So inclusion has an element of belonging in there. When people are saying it's not about inclusion, it's about belonging, tip, ask them, what does belonging mean? How do you define belonging? If they're able to define it, and I've never come across anyone who has, sooner or later, they're going to be talking about inclusion as well. So these two things are very closely related. So what is the issue that we're trying to understand when we're talking about inclusion and diversity specifically? It's about what we call the three biggest problems: people, potential, performance. I came across this from my own research, and when I look at other people's research and the client work I do, everything falls under these three things. So people means organizations struggle to engage the people they want to include. Potential, organizations struggle to create a culture of inclusion where everyone can reach their potential. And then the final one is performance. People are bought into this idea of a business case for diversity, but actually in truth, what I rarely see is this in action. So they're not able to say, they're able to say why diversity and inclusion is good in general, but what they're not able to say is why it's good for them within their specific organization. So people will tell you that, and we're going to focus on this. So this is another inconvenient thing that I say. People will tell you that the business case for diversity has been proved. It's been established. People will present research that says, look, here's an example. Diverse organizations are more profitable. They're more innovative. They avoid groupthink. And those things are true. However, if you look at this as the body of research, and I have, and this is what we're about to do now, you'll see, oh, here we go. The business case for diversity hasn't been established in the way that everyone would like you to think. So this is a case, you can download this, right? The business case for equality and diversity, a survey of the academic literature. This is done by the British government, Department for Business, Innovation and Skills. This department doesn't exist anymore. The report does. So they reviewed like over 100 papers, cases, meta studies. What they found was this. Studies have found evidence that firms have reaped business benefits, but not all firms in all contexts at all times. And look at the bottom, there is no single approach. So when people tell you that the business case for diversity has been proved, it hasn't, not consistently for everyone. So I believe, in the work we do with organizations, there is a business case for diversity, but you have to find your own business case. The other thing I talk about, which is incredibly inconvenient, but massively topical, is unconscious bias training. Last week, I was featured in Wired Smarter, and they were talking about, or sorry, it's Wired Magazine. There was an article talking about unconscious bias training and that it's creating a diversity disaster. This is something I used to talk about a lot. Now, a lot more people are talking about this. I look at unconscious bias training, and I've never really understood if it worked or how it worked. There's this narrative that it works, and we all have unconscious biases. And of course, we'll do this training and then we will address that. But I've never seen anything consistent to show that it worked or that it got the outcomes that we wanted. And when we talk about the outcomes we want, what are those? The outcomes are to address the three biggest problems, right? You address these, you're going to have an inclusive organization, or at least you're going to have a less divisive organization. So that's me thinking, okay, I don't agree. Not that I don't agree with unconscious bias training. It needs to form part of an ongoing strategy, but the literature, the research agrees with me. So here, this is, and I want to draw your attention to this. This is a study, a meta study, real world context. So it's not MBA students, right? It's real organizations, real people, and it's a review. And how many? There were 30 articles. So there's a review of 30 articles, all talking about unconscious bias training. And what did they find? Robust data is lacking for many of these interventions. Caution is thus advised when it comes to programs aimed at reducing biases. So far, we've got the business case for diversity isn't consistently proved, like everyone's saying. And also, one of the #1 go-to tools that everyone's telling you, unconscious bias training, the research is telling us that it doesn't work in the way that you may have been promised. So as we get to the end of our presentation, what is the solution? You may be thinking that I'm presenting you with loads of bad news. So when we work with organizations, we suggest this, the elements of inclusion. And funnily enough, that's the name of our organization. What do we say? We need to socialize, support, you need to address systems and solutions. We do all these 4 things. It helps you to address those 3 biggest problems that we spoke about. Now, I'm not going to be able to talk about this in detail. I'm going to run through this very quickly. So the first thing is social. We need to socialize people and we need to socialize ideas. We need to we need to have an ongoing process of conditioning. When you join an organization, you're socialized. They have an induction, right? You watch videos, you used to meet people in the same place, right? We need to do that with regards to inclusion. It's not a one hit, it's not one training. It needs to happen all the time. Support. people talk about reverse mentoring. People talk about mentoring, how it's important. I agree, but it needs to be part of a developmental network. It's not just about one-to-one relationships. You need a network of developmental relationships with an inclusive focus. Next is systems, formal and informal. The formal systems is what you'll hear people talk about. We need to look at recruitment. We need to look at retention. We need to look at promotion. These are the key things which are all very HR driven. That's important, but there's also informal systems that exist within an organization. Why is it that the people who always get promoted drink in that pub? Or why is it that this person's friends are always getting the best opportunities? Why is it that people who go to that school always get chosen? These are informal systems. They exist, they produce and reproduce predictable outcomes. And then the final thing is solutions. And this, frankly, from my perspective, is what I am also looking for. So this is the most theoretical part of this, which is it's basically what the business case is claiming. If we've got an inclusive organization, it's going to create opportunities. It's going to create innovations that don't exist. Some of our existing problems will be reduced, and some of the things that we want to see create will exist. Now, as I said, this frankly is based on cultural. I've done a focus based on cultural innovations. I'm always looking for more case studies. But these elements of inclusion are what we use when we work with clients, and it helps us to get more consistent results than anything else that I've encountered. So that brings us to the end of our time in terms of our sound bites. If you've got any questions, any ideas, any points or observations, happy to talk that through with you now. So I'm going to close this slide and hope you found that useful.
Yeah, really great, Jonathan. Thank you very much. And I think lots of questions coming up through the chat. So, you know, universities are one of these organizations that have a lot of trouble in putting all these elements together that you've been talking about. You know, I mean, when we look across the university, it's pretty obvious. I mean, you were at the LSE, so you know what that looks like. I used to be at the LSE too, so I know what it looks like. And UCL looks pretty much the same. And I mean, the other thing is that you see an interesting element of that, which is that when you look across the university, you see certain kinds of disciplines have much better representation than others do, and I don't know whether those, and it's not because those disciplines are any more inclusive than others, it's to do with other kinds of structural features. So what do you think about, we're looking at the university from the outside, you know, what kind of potential do you think we have, these big institutions that we're sitting in, to actually really make significant change?
I think there is a massive opportunity, but we also have to remember that universities, certainly the LSE and the Russell Group, they position themselves as businesses. They often refer to the students as clients. And so if we look at the LSE in particular, it's very international. It's a massive international cohort of students. And so if we're talking about representation, there's a lot of representation. There really is. If we're talking, and when we're talking about that, let's be really specific what we mean. We're talking about national, perhaps cultural, ethnic, racial. There's a lot of that. However, and that's an easy argument. However, when we look at other aspects, or if we look at other things like social mobility, a lot of these people will come from a particular class. A lot of these students come from a particular class. And so if we were to look at, let's say we're talking about ethnic diversity in a Russell Group university, you may find that a lot of that ethnic diversity comes from outside of the UK. If we look at the ethnic diversity from students within the UK, we're not going to see much at all. And so we have to be clear about what we're trying to look at, what representation means. But I do think absolutely organizations, institutions like the Russell Group universities, they've got a massive opportunity, but they do need to change dramatically. However, we're at a time where I'm sure everyone here will agree, there is dramatic change being experienced by higher education. If we can't do this now, when can we do it?
Yeah, and that's really the gauntlet, isn't it? That's down on the floor, really, that we have to respond to. And I think it forms part of one of the questions that's bubbling up in the chat. So I'm just going to read it to you, if I may.
Please, yes.
So it says, so who has this white quality that you spoke of? By this definition discussed, are we not just talking about the elite? So are northern white working class not just as much at the bottom as black people?
That's a good question. That's a good question. So so when we talk about whiteness as a quality, think of it as it allows you to have, what did we say? Social, economic, and political benefits, right? So what does that mean? So if we move beyond the economic benefit, actually, let's focus on the economic benefits, because there's something called an ethnic penalty, right? If we look at labor force survey in the UK, Office of National Statistics, we're going to see a hierarchy of people who are of earnings. Now, at the top, and this argument is often being used to try and dismantle or undermine the argument of things like white privilege or the racial hierarchy. At the top, you'd expect me to say that it's people who are white, but actually, you're going to find that it's people who are Chinese at the top. That's based on the experience and the data that I've seen in the past 2 to 3 years. And that's often used to say, well, hold on, there isn't this racial hierarchy. At the bottom, you see people who are Black African, Black Caribbean, Bengali, Bangladeshi as well. And so number one, there is a hierarchy, but in terms of white working class, this is where we've got this intersectional identity of, well, if you're northern white working class, you definitely don't have some of the class benefits that accompany the privilege of being in the racial hierarchy, but there are other benefits. So if we look at the examples in the US, the experiences of, and even in the UK, of, let's say, Black men, their experiences with institutions like the police, with education. Now, as there is research that says that white working class boys in particular are struggling and are not meeting their expectations. Yes, and that's part of it. But if we look at the experiences of young Muslim men and women, their experiences as well, they don't have the same benefits that being white does. And also, if we look around as well in the representation of culture, when you think of Muslim culture, Eastern culture, African cultures, and we were having this conversation, Henrietta, about the perspective of COVID and what that looks like in terms of a Western context, how Western norms and life is presented is an advantage and a privilege. So let me give you an example. I had a conversation with someone who was Greek. I was in a relationship with someone who was Greek. And I said to her, what does it feel like? And she said, what do you mean? I said, what does it feel like when everything about your culture is presented as being good? In the English language, we've got Greek words, right? So we've got Greek words. Greek history is presented as being incredibly positive and informative. Greek culture is celebrated. So if you're Greek, you belong to this culture and ethnic group that is celebrated all around the world. And I said to her, that's an experience I don't know. My family's from Ghana. I'm Black African in terms of my ethnic background. That is not presented as being anything positive or to be celebrated. So if I look at the media and if I look at books, it's presented in a completely different way. So I say that to show that the privilege or the whiteness is not just about economics. It's also about culture and how we are represented in society. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And it connects as well to the next question, which is coming from Anton Kutusov. And Anton's asking, this year we have seen how all-encompassing movements like Black Lives Matter have been used in a plethora of different ideological ways. How to structure the ethical foundations of such movements to prevent people from acting in a binary, aggressive, exclusive, and lynching manner under their banner, just as they did other seemingly more harmful slogans in the past. So how do we prevent that binary from taking back over, I think is what Anton's asking.
I think one of the biggest things we have to do is to be really transparent about what the meaning is in terms of Black Lives Matter. Like Black Lives Matter was founded by 2 women. I don't know if people know that. Even what we shared just now, I don't know if everyone here has heard about Black Lives Matter. How many people have actually gone to the website to see what is it you want? What are you talking about? A lot of people don't do that. So I would point people to actually understand the source, what it's actually about. When I talk about it, I tend to, people try and reduce it. And I can see when we're writing, say BLM, I actually say Black Lives Matter as a reminder of what we're talking about. Because, but this is a pet peeve, because when I'm working with in organizations, when we start to say BLM, then we're talking about HR, D&I, it can become another acronym. So I like to really remind people what it is about. And so one is being clear about what it's about. And two is being really transparent about the core beliefs and principles that underpin it. And we can do that better now than we could at any time in history.
Yeah, yeah. And so there's another question coming from Nick Edward Woolley, and he's asking, do you think that the first lockdown had a major impact on the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement? I mean,
massively,
in some sense, bring it into focus?
Massively, massively. So if we take a trip down memory lane, it was a real lockdown. Everyone's at home, they're looking at their screens. There's a lot of anxiety. People aren't seeing their friends, they're not seeing their family, and typically people are just looking at screens. So it got a lot of attention. We have to remember, Black men being killed by the police is not an unusual event. It's happened before, and it's happened several times since. No one's really talked about it. It didn't get that much attention. You saw Black squares on Instagram and on social media. You saw, me personally, there are people reaching out, are you okay? People wanted to engage in something. And I think it was a cruel set of circumstances that brought this to the public light. Had this happened a year ago, I don't think anyone would care. Frankly, I don't think we would have spoken about it. I think it's unusual circumstances in 2020. So I completely agree with you. Yes, it did have a major impact.
Yeah, and also the impact of COVID itself, which revealed the systemic inequalities in the UK and in other places around the world, made a difference because it became very stark.
Absolutely. I think what's happened this year is a lot of inconvenient truths have been revealed. Yeah. And it's hard to hide from them. And so one of our challenges is, how do we address them moving forward?
Yeah, how do we work with that positively? So there's another question coming, Jonathan, from Chris Harker, saying, thanks for the clarity of definitions across your presentation, but could you define organization? In particular, I'm interested in how such a definition helps us identify places within organizations where change can happen or best happen.
That's the, yeah, and thanks, Chris, for that point, and thank everyone for all the questions so far. I've got a very particular bias here. So when I say organizations, I tend to mean profit-making organizations, organizations who employ. So typically, we work with organizations that employ more than 500 people. They've got leaders, they've got infrastructure in place, they've got maybe an HR department, a diversity and inclusion department. So when I speak to organizations, I'm thinking of them. A lot of what I say actually impacts other types of organizations, non-profit organizations, startups. You saw that I was doing some work with GV earlier this year as well. So it's not just about that group, but when I think of organizations, I'm thinking of that group. It is important though. So remember when I was talking about the 3 biggest problems, to your point about sort of identifying places where things can change, it can be a department. So it's not just about this organization that makes profit. This could be a local group. So I think of it as I'd probably encourage you to think of an organization in terms of people working towards a particular goal. Yeah. Right? A shared vision or a shared goal. Yeah. That's probably a better way of thinking about it. But yeah, I've got a very particular focus when I'm speaking about these things. Yeah, but there's always that anxiety, isn't it, that organizations have a tendency to say, oh, this is something that has to take place in the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion unit, right? Absolutely. Which is actually the last place we want the transformation to take place, because those guys are already doing it. Absolutely. And it needs to be part of everyone. So this is this should be business as usual, in the sense that this is part of everyone's norm. That's what we're trying to do. So when I said socialize, we want everyone to be socialized, not just senior leaders, not just people who work in HR, not diversity and inclusion. Everyone needs to be socialized in order to make this work.
Yeah. So we've got another question coming to you from Tingri Zhang saying, I guess racism is or will be a development issue. With the processing of the progression of globalization and replacing of the generations without colonization and colonial thinking, do you think racism will disappear in the future? What's your opinion? Thanks.
Well, and thank you. I'm quite naive. Or else I wouldn't be able to do this. so the way I think about this, and it is a quite naive way of thinking about it, despite grabbing all this research and everything, is, okay, if we're saying that racism is a system of advantage, it had to be constructed, right? It had to be created. And so therefore, there must be processes in order to deconstruct it. It needs to be replaced with something else that, frankly, I don't know what that looks like. We can claim it's meritocracy. I'm not going to say equality for the reasons I said. So diversity, recognizing our differences and valuing them. But we have to remember that if it is a system of advantage, there are people who are benefiting right now. And this is, and I'm talking about this from an intersectional perspective. There are certain people who benefit from the status quo in abundance. And so there will be a reluctance for that to change. So do I think it's possible theoretically for this to change? Yes. I'm hopeful of that. I don't think we have all the tools to do that. I'm not claiming to have all the tools. What I'm presenting now is my contribution, and based on what I see, for us to get a little bit closer. Maybe it will be somebody like you who's going to come up with a better idea, and I really hope it is.
Well, I certainly think that the idea that we could develop further and more effective tools through practice is an important way forward for a lot of people, because it's actually actually moves you forward and gets things done. I mean, that's certainly a starting point, I think. So the next question is from Sertash Selikoglu, and she's saying, in my experience and observation, most of the racist attitudes present their racist claims wrapped in seemingly more objective reasonings. And in a workplace, for instance, Black and brown behaviors are easily marked as inappropriate or less smart. And most of the time, the markers of better performance are already evaluated in very white standards and aesthetics. So being smart can be evaluated with a certain accent and articulation. My question here is, would it help to address white prejudices would addressing white prejudice be more helpful in combating the unconscious biases? So she's pushing back, I think, on your unconscious bias against unconscious bias.
Sure. Or maybe my conscious bias against.
Yeah, your conscious bias, yeah.
And don't get me wrong. So there's two parts to this. So I really like the point about most of the time, the markers of better performance are already evaluated in very white standards. That's consistent with the racism as a system of advantage, right? So being white or the markers of whiteness are normalized. So you must have heard of this. You type in, I think it's hair or unprofessional hair into Google, and there's pictures of Black women. So, and with or Black women with natural hair, or Black women in braids. And this is immediately, this is Google, right, is presenting this as being unprofessional. So I agree with you to that extent as well. There are some norms that are presented to be professional and appropriate, and anything other is a departure from that, and therefore it's inappropriate. It's not professional. So I agree. Being smart is evaluated with a certain accent. Absolutely. And this is part of this power structure. It's deliberate. So, and that's my point. I don't think it's an accident. If you accept what I said about this system of advantage, it means it's not an accident. It's constructed and it's designed, which means it produces and therefore reproduces itself. So to some extent, yes, to the unconscious, but what can we do? Your question, actually, I've got it here. What would help to address it? Well, there's a book, White Fragility, and one of the good things about that book that I like, it talks about interrupting racism. So none of us can claim that we're going to fix this ourselves, but what we can do in our lives is interrupt the system just interrupt it. Just as you've done there, you've called something out, you've drawn attention to it. Can everybody see this? Is everybody aware of this? What do we think? If we can do that enough times, once again, let's see what happens, because none of us knows how this is going to be addressed properly. And I don't think anyone who claims they've got the answer, I don't see how they could, but obviously we should be listening to see how it can work. But at least something that gives us agency are those interruptions. And that can address some of the unconscious biases that you're talking about.
So we've got another question coming, which is asking, how do you rationalize equality of opportunity, which is possible, and equality of outcome impossible, perhaps? As an organization, should we be focusing on hiring BAME individuals as a proportion of the UK demographics, for example?
Yeah, so I think that's something so rationalizing equality, because I think that's a decision that needs to be made, or it's more of a statement. Do we care about equality of outcome? So as you saw earlier, I tend to avoid using the word equality in this context. I definitely wouldn't be saying we need or should be striving for equality of outcome. I do like, when I talked about inclusion, I was talking about everyone shares the same advantages and benefits. Now, there might be a semantic issue, because you might think, well, you said same advantages and benefits. Probably what a more useful way to think about that is having access to the advantages and benefits subject to where we are in terms of our diversity and our identity. For example, and you've probably seen this image. I actually was going to use it here. I stopped using it because it draws too much attention to the metaphor, but there's a fence. There's three people of differing heights, all trying to watch the ball game, and they're all standing on the same, they're all standing on a box of equal size, which means that the short person still can't see, the tall person gets even higher. And so then actually, if you give the shorter person more of the benches, one person doesn't need it, they all get to watch the game. I avoid doing that because everyone starts talking about that metaphor, but I think that's a useful way to think about opportunity. If some people need support, help, access in ways that others don't, and so we should take that into account, hence more the equity argument. With regards to, should we be focusing on hiring BAME individuals as a proportion of the UK demographics? I think that depends on your own business case. So there's typically, when people talk about a business case of diversity, there's three things. So number one is access and legitimacy, which refers to that, right? So it's the idea that in order for us to be legitimate, we need to reflect the marketplace, our customers, our clients, yeah? Or if we're all going to start a business and our target market is Nigeria, would it be useful for us to have, to know and understand Nigerian culture? Would it be useful for us to have some Nigerian people working with us? The answer is yes, it'll give us access to that market. Then there's the integration and learning. This is where everyone talks about when we integrate different people, we get better results. We integrate those differences, we avoid groupthink, we're more innovative, we're more collaborative, all of those things. And then the final thing is the social justice arguments, right? Fairness and discrimination. So I would argue your approach to diversity and inclusion should depend on which of those is your primary interest. It sounds as if you were talking about access and legitimacy is your primary interest. If it is, and if it's appropriate to you, then yes, you should pursue that. My point is there is no one size fits all, hence what I said earlier. This is why you should decide that for yourself, but you need those tools to be able to do that. So even just this conversation allows you to think about that for yourself.
Yeah, to make the business case that you need to make for change within your own organization. Yeah. So we've got another question from Nick Edward Woolley. Thank you, Nick Edward, for coming back again. So speaking of the Greek culture, do you believe that the Afro-American fashion and music culture has been or is being celebrated around the world by many races, including the privileged class? And what about cultural appropriation?
Sure. Okay. So, because he's talking about Greek culture, but I think you're actually talking about African American culture. Has it been celebrated around the world in many races? I think it has. Yes, definitely. But that's a particular characterization of it's a particular characterization of those people, of those groups. So if we're talking about hip hop, hip hop is a global phenomenon. We'd all agree with that. Hip hop is 40, 50 years old now, between 40 and 50 years old. However, hip hop has particular representations of Black people that we would all agree aren't always positive. It's got a particular representation of women that we would all agree aren't always positive. But if we go back to that idea of Greek culture, there may be some aspects of Greek culture which we could all present as being not very positive, but actually there's so many that are ingrained in our culture, like I said, even in our language, that are positive. So I get the point, but I think we need to look at the multiple aspects of it as opposed to one. Cultural appropriation. I'd like to know a little bit more about what you mean by that, because sometimes that word gets misrepresented. If we talk about hip hop and things like that, if we talk about music, there are people who benefit from particular, or who actually rebadge or misrepresent or represent cultural markers and present them in a different way. And maybe they get access, they get benefit opportunities that other people don't get. Once again, I'm going to say something you're going to know better than me, but I think I saw, I can't remember who it was, some sort of Instagram influencer with braided hair, the sort of hair you'd associate with Black women. And I think they were presenting it as a new hairstyle, or maybe the media presented it as a new hairstyle. And actually that's misrepresenting the reality of life. So I think that's an example of cultural appropriation. Am I saying that people who aren't Black shouldn't braid their hair like that? No, but actually, and this brings us back to the Greek argument, we know where that came from. Whereas in this context, it's presented as if it didn't come from or have any relationship with perhaps the Black community or African communities for thousands of years. I hope that makes sense. But actually, it's a good, useful way to think about that in terms of the Greek culture. Great point.
Okay, so then we've got a question, excuse me, which is asking you, it's from Ike Danum, and Ike is asking, where would you draw the line between allyship and white saviorism?
Great question. So allyship, here's the thing. A lot of people are talking about allyship and being an ally. If you listen to my podcast, I never ever talk about it. I never talk about this. Reason being, I'm not sure how long people will be talking. Like, this is something that is quite different from what everyone else is saying. Everyone's saying you need to be an ally, be an ally. This is how you become an ally. I completely don't address that. And why is that? Because I think probably because I don't have a clear understanding myself of the line that you're drawing attention to, Ika. I don't think I do. So being an ally, I would probably want someone to define that for me in meaningful terms, and then I'd be able to get it. Because you've heard the term ally before. Has anyone told you what it means? Do you accept what it means? I'm struggling. It's like belonging as well. It gets used. I don't really know what it means. But the concept of white saviorism, I think, is a problem. And for those who aren't really familiar with that, it's the hero complex or the white savior complex. So, you know, when you see things like Comic Relief in the UK has come under a lot of fire for this. So typically you'll see someone, a celebrity who you wouldn't normally associate with these things, and they're hugging a Black child or an Asian child in their village somewhere, and I care so much, and I'm here, it's so important, and then they disappear again, get back on their jet, all of that kind of stuff. And this white savior complex that it requires, and we see this a lot in narrative, in stories, in films, that it requires a white hero to save the indigenous population, the Black population, the brown population, pick your minority group, but it needs someone from the majority to come and pluck them out of obscurity. It can be a challenge. It can definitely be a challenge. I think what I would say is think about your intent. What is your intent and your long-term act? What's your long-term contributions to that? It's one thing to dip in and out of things, and I think you have to be careful, but if we're talking about being anti-racist and being an ally, whatever that means, I think that should be an ongoing process as opposed to something you turn up to every once in a while. So that may be helpful.
Now that's stirred up quite a lot of questions, as you can imagine, Jonathan, and I think those will have to come offline. But I just want to ask you one more, which is from Roman Malin-Hiscock, and he's asking, what's your position on defunding the police in the UK and directing funding elsewhere? And as you mentioned, the book White Fragility argues that the impact of one's opinions or actions is more important than the intention. So what's your advice for when someone has to confront this argument in real world situations? What should be done?
Okay, well, given the time we've got, I did a book review of White Fragility.
Yeah.
So it wasn't as if I loved everything in the book. I picked a couple of things that were useful. I thought there were loads of things that didn't land right, but apparently that's part of the narrative now. So that is answered there. Particularly because I struggled with that. It's like you know, if so, yeah. So that was something I struggled with. I've got a quick and easy answer about defund the police. I tend not to talk. I tend to stay in my lane. I don't know enough to give a meaningful answer, if we're being absolutely honest. And I'm not going to claim or try and attempt to. I suspect that everyone in this room, or certainly person who answered, Roman, you answered the question, I suspect you know a lot about it, more about it than me. And it's something that I would look to you to learn more about in terms of defunding the police. Whilst I've come across things, but I don't have an articulate response to it.
Well, we really need to transform the police force, but we do need the police, I think. I mean, I think defunding the police is a complex argument that needs to be made more in a more rounded way, as you say.
Yeah.
So,
and I think the people who are saying it, once again, they're articulate. They've got very clear meanings and understandings that will get misrepresented. I'm sure of. Yeah,
that's a point well taken. So we should do a bit more research on these things ourselves.
And I certainly will. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Me too. So, Jonathan, thank you for a fantastic hour. Really, really enjoyable. Great talk. Great questions. Everybody loved having you here at the IGP, and I would like to thank you and hope that you'll join us again. Yeah,
I will do.
So
thank you very much.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you.
Thanks for indulging me.